For the first time in years, Litecoin could be on the verge of a multi-X rally on its USD pair, and let me tell you why. Now, Litecoin has been around for a long time. It's an OG crypto, 10 plus years. And in these 10 plus years, we've been able to gather a lot of data for Litecoin, of course. And over the cycles, there have been similarities, specifically around the halving times. Around the halving times, Litecoin does tend to play out in a very similar way. Not exactly the same, but in a very similar way. So for example, if we zoom in here on 2016 and we stretch this out so that we can actually see it a bit, there's one thing that is not specific to Litecoin. It happens quite a lot across the crypto space, and that's the pre-halving peak. That's what I like to call it. And as the name would suggest, it's a peak or a rally right before the halving. This is not unusual. And in 2016, we got this. We got a rally up to the peak. We then came back down. And put in a higher low. And note that the higher low is important because we have this trend of higher lows for close to a year. And you could argue I could stretch this out even longer, but more or less close to a year after and during the pre-halving peak. Again, we come back down, we get a second little rally up. It's not as defined here in 2016, but you will see later in 2020 that it is much clearer, the rally that we get, but note that it is a lower high. So we get a lower high for the second rally up, come back down to this trend one last time, again putting in a higher low, one last time before we get our bull run move. And you can see here this really strong candle up that ultimately ended up in a 10,000% rally for the bull run for Litecoin. Now, if I go back to automatic here and take a look at 2020 halving, the 2020 halving, what do we see? Now at point 1, we get our pre-halving peak. Now note that the duration here between the halving and the peak is a lot bigger than 2016. There's a big difference by 2 or 3 months, more or less, between what we got in 2016. But note that we usually get this peak a maximum of about 3 months before the halving, and sometimes we get it a few weeks before the halving. But either way, we get it. We then come back down and put in a low. This was the COVID low as well, so I think we fell an extra little bit and dropped 2 new lows. But once we put in that low, we again saw Litecoin putting in the higher lows like we saw back in 2016, higher lows, and we get a little rally up. Again, note that the rally up is a lower high from the pre-halving peak. So we get the lower high, we come back down, put in a higher low, and then we get our bull run move. So note specifically these 2 moves. We get a pre-halving peak and we put in a low, quite a strong low, a severe low. We get our post-halving peak that's usually lower than the first, the pre-halving peak, and then we put in another severe low. And you can see this rally that we went on to have was about 1000% of a move, just under. So the difference between those 2 moves is quite drastic. Now, if we take a look at what we've currently had so far with Litecoin, we had the halving back in April of 2024. I'm sure most people are aware of this, and like in 2016, we got a pre-halving peak that was very close to the halving, a couple of weeks away basically. In 2016, it was about a month back. Here, it's similar enough, 3 or 4 weeks. Now, there's quite a few differences basically with what we saw back in 2024 with this halving and since. Now, usually we get this slow lower high trend. It usually starts before we get the pre-halving peak. But back in 2020, of course, we saw that it started after the pre-halving peak, but that was also before the halving. Here, we've started this slow trend up of higher lows well after the halving. And we can see that the time that it took us to put in this low is much longer than what we had previously. Usually it's quite a sharp drop, and then we slowly trade up for a while, 6 or 7 months, before we get this third point 3, where we get in our lower high. Now, I'm sure the sharp people in the audience will have noticed that this is not a lower high, it's a higher high. So already there's a big difference here. Now I could understand if you disregarded this higher low trend starting late. I don't think that's a huge deal breaker. We see a similar thing here starting at 2, slowly trending up after that. That's not a problem for me. But the higher high, 2 discrepancies, may be something to take note of. Okay, things aren't playing out the exact same as before, but maybe the general structure is playing out. Well, if that's the case, you might argue that this point 3 here should return to this trend line, down to tag this trend line before we finally get our final rally up. And now there's no reason, right, for us not to believe that. It could say, if it's going to play out the same, we will come down and tag this trend line. However, if we look back again at previous cycles and measure roughly how long it takes for us to, when we put in this high, to come down to the low. Here we can see that back in 2020, it took us 5 or 6 weeks from the high to the low. If we go back to 2016, again, from 3 to 4, the high to the low took us 5 or 6 weeks, basically the same amount of time. If we take a look at how many weeks it's currently been since we put in this high at 0.3, you can see we're currently on week 7 or 8. So we're already 2 weeks plus. Now you can make a valid point and say, well, we got a serious drop here. We came down to a low at this point of $92 from a high of 150 during about a similar time frame. Surely this is our low, and that's a very valid point. But then you basically have to disregard this higher low trend line that we've seen, which isn't too much of a problem. But again, it just emphasizes the fact that this cycle is quite different for Litecoin. It's not following traditionally or as closely as it has before. It's not following what's happened previously. So depending on which you think is more likely, do we follow the time frame or do we follow the moves, the general moves down? Depends on what you might expect to happen in the coming months. So if you're in the camp of, I expect Litecoin to come down to this low and then we'll see our bull run, then traditionally, if we take a look at how long it takes for 0.4 to reach 0.5, 0.5 being the peak, kind of the bull run peak, peak mania, peak price, back in 2020 or 2021, it took 33 weeks. Back in 2016 or 2017, it took 45 from this 0.4 to this 0.5. Now that's a big discrepancy, but if you want to skew things a tiny little bit and say we're actually going to measure from when we first get this move here, when the bull run move really starts, not measuring from the low, which is 4, we're measuring from when the bull run starts. We shave off a couple of weeks here. This now becomes 39 weeks. And if we go here and say, oh, well, let's measure from where the bull run really starts, that's basically already where we are, which is about 33 weeks. So we can narrow the gap a small little bit. And I'm going to take an average of 39 and 33, which gives us 36 weeks. So again, I'm going to zoom out here, bring this to 36 weeks, and assuming that we come back down to this trend line within a month, that gives us a bull run peak in November of 2025. And notice that that's a very similar time frame in terms of months to the 2017 peak that we got early December or mid-December, excuse me. So another end of year peak, not out of the question and not unusual either. However, it's obviously not very comparable in terms of month seasonality to the 2021 bull run, which of course peaked out in May for Litecoin. So, okay, we know what to expect if it's going to play out in terms of tagging the higher low trend line. What happens if you think the low is already in? Well, again, I'm going to zoom this down so I can see, and we're going to bring this back a few weeks, giving us a September peak. Now, the September peak is a bit of an outlier, and that would be a new thing, basically, but that doesn't mean that it can't happen. Now, usually with crypto, the kind of summer months aren't very busy, aren't very active, but that doesn't mean that we should assume the crypto space can't put in highs during that time. And we kind of saw Litecoin put in a peak here back in August, September time. So who's to say that that couldn't be when we also put in another peak? So either way, if you're looking at it following this kind of a pattern, you're expecting a Q4 peak. Whether it's September, whether it's November, I don't know. I definitely don't know. It's up to you to decide. Now, in terms of how far up we could go, that's an interesting point, because if you look at obviously the previous cycles, Litecoin's first post-halving rally, 10,000%, pretty crazy. The second one, a really big difference of 800%, bit of an extreme difference. So what can we expect here? Well, based on, I always say expect diminishing returns over the cycles. As a crypto asset gets bigger, you shouldn't expect it to still be putting in these crazy multi-1,000% moves. But to actually draw from what we've seen before, what's currently up isn't really that useful. It's hard to distinguish a pattern. This is a 10th of what we got in the previous cycle. So a 10th of this would be 80%. I think we can rule that out. I think Litecoin will do better than an 80% move. It's already made stronger moves from 2 to 3. But if we if we be a bit cheeky and we basically draw a trend line here from these lows, and that gives us a rough map kind of how Litecoin has slowly put in higher lows as the cycles have gone on, and we measure from this point here, from the start of where we put in these higher lows, we can see that gives us a 1,800% move. Now, roughly, onto the next cycle, we got half of that, give or take. If you double 850, it turns into 1,700. Pretty close to what we got last cycle. So if you want to follow that rule and half what we get, if we come back down to this trend line, a 400% move or a 500% move brings us to this high trend line that we've also seen Litecoin play out from a similar time frame. So I know I'm jumping around a bit here, but what I'm trying to get at is basically from where we started this slowly ascending wedge, basically over the long-term time frame, Litecoin's bull run moves have halved in percentage, give or take, a couple or minus a couple 100%. And potentially we could see that happen again, where we get somewhere around half of 800, puts us at around 400. Maybe we don't get something this high. Maybe we get something around 430, 420, which again gives you a $400 Litecoin, which is basically the previous cycle high, giving you just under a 4x of a price move. So TLDR, basically, quick summarize. In the medium term, I think we should see Litecoin do well. If the rest of the crypto space is obviously going to do well, Litecoin's going to do well with it. Maybe it might underperform a lot of other altcoins, but I still think there's a good chance Litecoin returns to the all-time highs. I think there's a good chance that it does it by the end of this year. And I think that even though we've seen recent price moves that contradict what's happened previously, I still think we could more or less see this play out in a very similar way. Me personally, opinion alert, I think we are probably going to come down to this trend line, but I don't know. But I do find it useful to look at these things. One final thing that I do want to show, if we pull up Bitcoin and we overlay it here, we can see that more or less any point, if you decide to buy Litecoin, Bitcoin has outperformed it, not only in the long term, but also the medium term, and most of the time also the short term. We can see obviously before this kind of 2018, 2017 bull run that we got, if you take any point after that, Bitcoin is more or less perpetually always higher than Litecoin, especially when it comes to the long term. I'm not doing this to try and annoy anyone, but I don't think many people would argue with the fact that Bitcoin is a lower risk asset in the crypto space. It's got the biggest market cap. It's been around the longest. If Bitcoin's going to go down, every other altcoin is as well. While if Bitcoin goes up, potentially your altcoin could go up higher. For at least the last 5 years, there hasn't been a point that Litecoin has outperformed Bitcoin in the short, medium, or long term. And for me, it doesn't make sense to take more risk with Litecoin for a lower return. We're going to explore this in more detail now on the Litecoin Bitcoin pair. So this is it, the Litecoin Bitcoin pair. If you've never seen this before, you're in for a shock because look, Litecoin put in a peak here against Bitcoin in November of 2013, and it's never returned to that peak. And to be honest with you, it's never been close to returning to that peak. And over the cycles, we've seen Litecoin continuously put in lower highs and lower lows. And again, like I said at the start of the video, over this period of time, we've seen Litecoin make similarities from cycle to cycle, specifically around the halving time. And as you can see on the Bitcoin pair, Litecoin has a tradition of just trading down for about a year leading up to the halving and for close to a year afterwards. Basically, around 2 years, Litecoin just trades down against Bitcoin and the halving happens somewhere within that time, close to the middle. Currently, we've seen more or less the exact same thing play out. I said this would most likely happen in some of my earliest Litecoin videos, and it has. It looks like we might have broken the trend here a little bit, but if you want to take a look at previous cycles, we can see that when Litecoin either breaks this trend, it either breaks it extremely drastically and goes and puts in a bull rally basically against Bitcoin, or like in 2020, it has a wick above, but ultimately it follows, it comes back down below and it follows the same trend. Now, I don't think Litecoin's going to trade down. It's going to follow this trend, but I don't think it's going to break up above too drastically. But there's a case to be made for that, where if we look at Litecoin, it's about a year, more or less, slap bang. In fact, it's a year basically bang on when it puts in a high after the halving. Now, it doesn't have to be the cycle high, but it's a pretty noticeable high. We can see in 2016, a year later in 2017, Litecoin put in a high that was pretty close to its cycle high. Pretty strong rally. And again, if we go back to 2020 halving, we go 53 weeks on, Litecoin puts in a high. And that was the cycle high for that year. So, we're not a year out now, so far, from the halving, but it could be the start of potentially a move similar to this. If we measure how far out we actually are, we are coming up close to the year. We've got about 40 weeks done, so another 3 months, and we are at that April timeframe when we had the halving, and where Litecoin could potentially put in a high on the Bitcoin pair. Now, if we take a look at how long these moves last for, back in 2020 or 2021, it was about 3 weeks. I'm looking at the wrong year. Excuse me. If we measure from this low here, to the high, it lasted about 2 months, give or take. If we go back to 2017, when do we get this high? From the low, it was about 9 weeks. But if you want to measure when it broke above the trend, it was about 6-7 weeks. So you could argue more or less 2 months is what you're looking at on average. That's, 2 months, pretty close to 3 months. We might have an anomaly, like we've seen so far on the US dollar chart, where it has been quite an anomaly. Maybe Litecoin rallies up against Bitcoin slowly but surely for the next 3 months and puts in a high again a year after the halving. Who knows? I certainly don't. One indicator that would suggest that we're overdue a high is if you measure from the last rally Litecoin gets for the cycle. So Litecoin usually gets one at the beginning of the cycle, one at the end of the cycle. If you measure from the one at the end of the cycle to the next rally that we get that's noticeable, this was the 2021 bull run, by the way, this green candle here, that often lasts somewhere around 110 weeks. We can see back in 2015 to 2017, it was much shorter. Currently, if you're counting this as the trend breaker, the noticeable green week, which it is, it's the first kind of time Litecoin has had 4 green weeks in a row since we put in this high and traded down ever since. Yeah, Litecoin has not had 4 green consecutive weeks on its Bitcoin pair since now. That's been 106 weeks, fits within the time frame, and usually that indicates a strong bull move, more or less. I hope that this isn't the strong bull move that previous years would indicate. Again, this year's been different, and there's no guarantees in crypto. Litecoin could go on and push this upper range anytime soon if it wanted to. There's no magical laws that say Litecoin has to play out how it did the last few cycles, but there's a lot of similarities, and if it wants to continue those similarities, it's not good news for Litecoin, to be honest with you. Another bearish thing is that we often see Litecoin put in kind of the cycle lows close to the halving, whether it's just after or just before. You can see here we did put in a low back in March 2024. So better bullish news, you could argue we won't put in a low until the end of this cycle. But bearish news might be, well, we're just going to continue down, going to follow the trend basically of putting in lower lows. I'm kind of torn. I wouldn't call myself a Bitcoin maxi, but I think Bitcoin is the best asset to hold in crypto for most of the cycle. And I think this chart does a brilliant job of explaining why. I mean, on average, if we take a look at how far Litecoin drops from cycle to cycle, you can see from first to second, the highs dropped by 50% and the lows dropped by 50%. From second cycle to third cycle, the highs dropped 70% and the lows dropped by 60%. So not only is it decreasing, but the rate at which it's decreasing is increasing. And then currently, from third cycle to fourth cycle, we don't have any data yet. The fourth cycle has only just begun. But if it's going to be an average of what we've seen before, average of 50 and 70 equals 60, Litecoin could peak out on its Bitcoin pair at 3,000 Satoshis. And the low, again, getting an average, would put you at lows, sorry, I have to zoom out for this, of 500 sats. And I will remind you that Litecoin launched at a price, or the high that it was at, soon after its launch, was about 0.05 Bitcoin. one Bitcoin was equal to 20 Litecoins. Now I wouldn't even be able to do the maths off the top of my head to calculate how many. Or in fact, if you want, we can we can invert the chart. So we can go 1 over, which shows you the inverse. So zooming out, we can see here at the peak, 20 Litecoins got you 1 Bitcoin. Now, at the current price, it's close to 1,000 Litecoins. Gets you 1 Bitcoin. So look, I don't make the rules. I don't change the stats. I give you the cold hard maths. That's what the maths says. Bitcoin has 50x'd against Litecoin over this 10-year time frame. But look, I'm gonna wrap it up there. If you guys liked the video, please leave a like, subscribe, consider sharing with your mates. Really helps out the channel, big time. If you didn't, leave a dislike too. That's totally fine. I'm always open to criticism. And please, if I missed something, let me know in the comments. Thanks so much, guys. Take care and peace.